even if you don't use them quantitatively as I present them here, you can use the ideas behind this quantitative analytics to help you do better prioritization and to help you think about your product in a little bit different way. I'll start with talking about a few, well, you might call them prioritization techniques. Basically, some of the ways you can think about prioritization. So one of the things is, because we're product managers, we're product managers oftentimes for a reason. We typically know our market, we know our product, particularly if we've been doing it for a while, working on a particular product. We know the product, we know the market, we know something about our customers. We've talked to the customers a lot. We know what's going on sort of in the world of our product. And so we build up some instincts as product managers. And part of the reason that we got into product management is because we probably have a certain level of ability of being empathetic to our customers, being able to do prioritization in our head, to be able to figure out which way to go, to be able to make decisions and things like that. So we probably have some good instincts to start with. The problem with instincts is that they're hard to justify oftentimes, and sometimes they're wrong. And so you really want to have some other things going for you in your prioritization process. Now, a lot of times we think of prioritization like, the Moscow prioritization method, which is must, should, could, won't, right? It's sort of like another version of high, medium, low. And it's the problem with these is they're kind of subjective, and they're subjective based on your instincts. So you can use them, and you can it makes it seem as though it's less subjective because I've given it, a high, a medium, a low. But the fact is it's still based on some intuition on my part, or maybe on my boss's part, or the highest paid person's part, to say what's most important. And it doesn't necessarily have a relationship to anything that you might consider even somewhat objective. Just depending on your instinct, it's good, and your instinct remains an important tool in your toolbox, but you really have to augment it with some other things. So some of the types of things you can do, you can also use sort of mental tricks to help you think through your decisions, and prioritization is just another decision. So some mental tricks like, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen if we were to either implement this feature that we're thinking about, or if we decided not to implement this feature that otherwise seems very important. And you can sort of model that out mentally, or you can write it down or something like that. You can play out a scenario that says, here's what our product would look like with this feature, here's what it would look like without the feature, who would it appeal to if we had the feature, who would it appeal to if we didn't have the feature, how important are those people, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing that you always have to keep in mind as product managers, as a product manager, I just ignore everything that's not already a high priority. The problem with being a product manager, even if you're using something like the Moscow method or high, medium, low, something like that, is I have way more high priority things or must things than I have capacity to implement typically. I have to decide amongst all my favorite children which of my children will become features, so to speak. And so that's why you need to have something that goes in addition to, I don't ever implement low priority features. Even the things that might seem low or seem minor, typically they're there. If I do implement them, it's because of some important reason. For example, you might say that fixing a typo in a message is low priority. But the fact is that a typo can make us look bad, which makes customers not trust us, which makes customers not want to renew. And that ends up being a bad thing. And so actually I like when I can fix typos. I don't like to have typos in the product in the first place. But if I can fix a typo, because that's so easy, I actually feel like I get a lot of benefit from making that relatively low cost fix, but it actually gives me a lot of benefit. So it's actually high priority, even though it seems small and minor. So there's certain types of things like that, but things that are less important generally don't even get it into the conversation about what I might prioritize for the next release or whatever it might be. But as I say, there's some mental things you can do, like this question: what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? Another one, I don't have it on the slide here, is you can think about, well, how will I think about this in 10 days or 10 weeks or 10 months? You think about the impact of this decision over multiple time periods. And this is actually a really good thing, not just for prioritizing features, but actually also for determining whether to slip a release. This is actually a really good model. You might say, well, I can either get the quality up to a level that is what I expect, but it's going to take me an extra 2 weeks to get that into the release, or I can release on the time at the time I said I would release it, but the quality will be lower. And so what you often want to do is you want to think, well, what will the customers, how will the customers feel about this in a few days? How will they feel about that decision in a few weeks? How will they feel about it in a few months or even years? Now, typically what I've learned in my experience is that customers are initially happy that the product comes out at the time you promised, but then because of the quality problems, they become more and more unhappy over time. And that again turns into a lack of retention, a lack of customer satisfaction, reduction in the net promoter score and things like that. And so basically in 10 months, they don't, if you were to release late, in 10 months, they won't remember that you released late, but they won't also think of you as a low quality product. Whereas if you release on time but with low quality, in 10 months, they still think of you as a low quality product. And so that's sort of the trade-off that you can use these mental models for. Now, another thing is you can pay attention to what your boss is saying is the most important thing, or maybe the highest paid person. And sometimes they actually know something, right? They are people that are in your market. They talk to your customers as well. They talk to analysts and things, oftentimes your boss or the executives of the company. And so their ideas may be very good, even if you don't necessarily agree with them, and maybe they seem to come out of left field. Now, the thing about these ideas is oftentimes your boss says, after you've created a roadmap or a plan for whatever the next release is, your boss or somebody higher up says, oh, we should also do this feature. And so you have to then have a different conversation. There's really two conversations. Why should we do that? And I'll give you some ways to have that discussion as we go through this presentation. But the other one, of course, is, oh, well, we can do it. What shall I remove from what we've already prioritized, right? From what you already agreed to? Because you can't just, we all know this, you can't just add more stuff in without taking stuff out, because you won't finish any of it. And then again, you end up with customers that are super unhappy. So that's a thing that you want to always be considering when you are taking on your boss's new feature that they just came up with. And oftentimes that is just the flavor of the week, and it's probably not something you should do, but you need a way to talk about that. And so we're going to talk about how to get to that point. And that's really through what I call strategy-based analytics. And I'll talk about what all the components of that phrase mean and how to use it for prioritization. So the fact is, as I mentioned, we have all these features we could do. They're all high priority, but we can only implement a few of them. And so we need to figure out which ones are the best ones of all the good ones, which are the best ones for us to implement. Now, we never can do as much as we want. That's just one of the realities of delivering products. And of course, as the product manager, one of the realities of your life is you have to be able to make that decision on what gets delivered and what doesn't. But if you have a well-articulated business strategy and objectives for the organization, whether it's your product organization or the company as a whole, if your company is a one-product company, you can use it to help you prioritize. Now, it has to be a little bit better articulated than things like, well, our strategy is to grow, or our strategy is to be more profitable. Those aren't really helpful, because first of all, they don't really say anything about your company. Every company is trying to do that. But if you have a strategy that's better articulated, and I'll give a little bit of an example as we go along, that will help you achieve that. So let's say, for example, that we have, this is a super simplified example. This is very unrealistic, this example, but it will give you the flavor of the way that this thinking goes. And that is to say, okay, we've got two features in our backlog. One of them is to localize our product in Japanese. One of them is to localize the product in German. So this means, I can sell it to people that speak Japanese, or I can sell it to people that speak German more easily. That's what my end goal would be. Now, if my strategy is to penetrate Germany, in other words, the next thing I want to do as my business, the next big marketing theme and, sales, everything, blah, 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 is I'm going to open up the business in Germany and try to sell a lot of my product in Germany. Then it's pretty obvious what feature you want to implement out of your backlog. You want to implement the localize the product in German. And the fact is that even though localizing the product in Japanese is very valuable, and if you have had a lot of Japanese speakers as your readers, as your clients, you would want to do that. But because you're not opening up Japan, you're opening up Germany, it makes a lot more sense to do German. So basically what we say is that the localization of the product in German is much better aligned with our strategy than localizing the product in Japanese. So very simple example. I didn't really have to explain it as much as I did, but now we're going to make the example a little more complicated. So let's say that instead of that very simple strategy, we have a slightly more complicated strategy. It still includes Germany, but it also includes some things like we want to close some competitive gaps against a particular competitor. So we obviously need to continue to sell in America. Let's say we're an American company, and we want to continue to sell against an American competitor, but we also want to start selling in Germany, or maybe Europe as a whole, but Germany first. We want to also increase our ability to sell in the financial services sector, which has been good for us, but we haven't rolled out there as much as possible. And of course, we have customer satisfaction issues because you always have those. So that means that the strategy is a little bit trickier. Now, one of the things I want to mention about my use of the term strategy is essentially a strategy is a collection of objectives, such as this, and it may be over a short time frame, or it may be over a bigger time frame. So you may be thinking about a strategy that is for the next quarter. It may be a strategy for the next year. It may be a strategy for the next 3 years. Now, typically in the business I'm in, which is enterprise software, 3-year strategies are a little bit long. Depending on the company, 1-quarter strategies are a little bit short, but year-long strategies probably make a lot of sense. For the company that I work with, a year-long strategy actually makes a lot of sense. Now, if you're a small software company, whether business to business or business to consumer, a quarter strategy might actually make a ton of sense, even a monthly strategy if you're going super fast. But basically the idea of the strategy, it's a set of objectives, of high-level objectives that you want to achieve in your sales process. So that's what you're really focusing on. So going back to the slideshow, that's the strategy. So now we say, okay, so I've got a bunch of features in my backlog, obviously more now than just the 2 of Japanese or German. I've got a bunch of other features. Some of them are aligned well with financial services. Some of them are good at addressing the competitive gaps I mentioned. Some of them satisfy customer needs. And so what I want to do for each of the features, for all the features in my backlog, or all the ones that are sort of close to the top of my backlog, I want to have an understanding and maybe even an explicit model of how those features relate to the potential things in my strategy. Now, again, my strategy in this case is open in Germany, address competitor A, financial services, and customer satisfaction. But there's a lot of other potential objectives I may have, maybe the following quarter, like I maybe want to say, well, banking sector for the following quarter. And I may say, oh, I want to open up in the Scandinavian countries, in 6 months, and so on and so forth. So there's all these different components of a strategy that your features could satisfy or not. And so you want to have your features embedded in a model of all the different objectives that could possibly be there and how well your features align with those objectives. So for example, in the first example, the feature of localizing in Germany aligns really well with going into Germany, or localizing in German aligns really well with the idea of going into Germany, whereas the feature of localizing in Japanese aligns really well with going into Japan, and it aligns very terribly with going into Germany. So if I had a feature that was both help me with German, with selling in Germany, and with financial services markets, I'm not sure what feature that would be really well aligned with my strategy. If I have a feature that is aligned with Going into the banking sector in Japan, that's really not well aligned with my strategy. And so every feature is going to be more or less aligned with the strategy, sometimes very strongly because it might satisfy multiple things. Like it's going to be fairly likely that some of your features will satisfy both the competitive gap, the desirableness of the financial sector, and customer satisfaction. It's very feasible to think that there might be features that align with all three of those, which means that feature is very strongly aligned with the strategy. If you implement that feature, you get wins on all aspects of the strategy, except the German one. And typically the German one will be probably an outlier for a lot of the different features. And it's going to have primarily one major set of features associated with the German piece. So what you want to do is you want to figure out for each of your features, how does it align with the things that are in your strategy? And this is actually, you might notice this is independent of for each feature, the things that it aligns with are independent of the strategy, right? You may have a strategy that says Germany financial sector, and then you may have a strategy that says Japan banking sector, and different features are, the same feature may or may not align with those, but it's independent of the strategy. Whatever the strategy happens to be, the point of defining the strategy is to say, oh, well, let me now pull out the features that best align. And this is easiest to do if you've created this model where all your features are related to all the potential objectives, all the potential strategic objectives, and then you can just weight them and figure out which one is best aligned with the objectives that you've chosen for your strategy. Okay, so the way that you use these things to prioritize is essentially you realize that strategies combine these objectives, and objectives are things like customers, market segments, market objectives, or themes. And so in our strategy example, I've got customer satisfaction issues that I want to address. I want to go after the financial services sector, and I've got a market theme that is open up in Germany. And then features align with customers. So maybe a particular customer has asked for a particular thing. Maybe multiple customers have asked for that thing. Features align with market segments. This feature will be good for financial services. This other feature will be good for banking. And they align with market objectives and themes. And they may align with, there may be some other things, but if you think of these three things, customers, segments, and objectives, those are a good set of things. You can also add in competitors, which I didn't put on this slide, but competitors would be another component of this if you wanted to put that in. And what I call this is the market model. So the market model is all the different objectives I could achieve, and then the relationship of each of those features to those objectives. And then when you select a certain set of objectives that you want to pursue, that naturally is going to bubble up a certain set of features that align best with those objectives. And so then what you do is you do the arithmetic that tells you which of the features aligns best with the objectives. So you can ask yourself these questions qualitatively, or you can, of course, do some analytics that gives you a numerical answer, and that's good. I'll show you the output of that in a minute. But things like the questions you're going to ask or the analysis you're going to do is it interesting to the customers who are important to my strategy? Does it help me achieve the market goals of my strategy? Will it help me be more successful with my target segment? Does it help close a competitive gap? So you can see all these things. Or open a gap against a competitor. And you can then weight these by importance, and then you can kind of add all the weights up, all the weighted relationships up to get what you might call a strategic score, or essentially it's a value for each feature in the context of that strategy or in the context of those objectives. And so then what you do to get the really nice picture is you map the features based on their strategic score versus their cost. And if you do something like that, you get a chart that looks something like this. Now this is a familiar 2x2 chart. It's got the magic quadrant, which is this upper right one. And the upper right quadrant is the things that are valuable to the strategy, that are well aligned with the strategy. And you have and they're relatively inexpensive. So cost goes from high on the left to low on the right. And so things that are in the upper right are low cost, but high value according to the strategy. Now, of course, you also have the lower left, which is things that are high cost and low value to the strategy. Of course, you don't want to work on those. And in reality world, most things have a value that's commensurate with their cost. So most of the features are actually going to lie on a diagonal. The more valuable features oftentimes are going to be more expensive, and the less valuable features, according to the strategy, will be less expensive. So now you can start to say, I want to do the features in the upper right, assuming you found them, and I don't want to do the features in the lower left, even though they may be great features if my strategy was different. And then I'm going to choose some other features along the diagonal. And of course, I'm still not going to be able to do everything because I don't have the capacity to do everything. But this at least helps me understand where each of the candidate features that I might work on aligns versus the strategy. So really we want to focus on this upper right quadrant. That's the magic quadrant, of course. But of course, in reality, again, it's often hard to find inexpensive and super valuable features. And so mostly you're going to work on the diagonal. So let's talk about the quantitative analytics compared to your intuition. So we talked about at the beginning that your intuition is an important component of your prioritization, right? And the reason is, we talked about all the reasons, right? We know stuff about our market, we know our customers, we have all this insight, but we don't have a way to back it up really with analytics. And so the nice thing about using this kind of market model approach, even if you do it only qualitatively, but even more so if you do it actually quantitatively, is you have analytics to back up your intuition. And if the results of the analytics don't align with what you already think, then it means there's a couple of potential problems. One is that maybe your model is not correct. Maybe you didn't relate the features to the strategic components correctly. Maybe the strategy is actually incorrect. And if you sort of have if your intuition says it's pretty clear to my intuition that we should be doing this, going this direction, and the strategy says, oh, we should be going this direction, then maybe the strategy is incorrect. Of course, there's also the possibility that your intuition is wrong, and in which case you need to revisit it and get it back on track. So all of those things are possible, and it may even be a combination of those things that you need to think about when you compare your intuition to your strategic analytics. Now, the other thing about this is if your boss does have that pet feature that they want, or the hippo has the feature, then you have a way to talk about that feature in the context of the strategy. You can say, oh, well, tell me how this feature aligns with the strategy, the strategic objectives that you told me about, Germany, financial services, etc. How does this feature align with those? Because I'm not quite seeing it. You might not want to be snarky in that way, but you get the point. And then you can have a conversation with your boss, and your boss might say, oh, you know what, you're right. It doesn't align with the strategy. Or your boss might tell you some way that it aligns with the strategy that you didn't understand, which sometimes happens. Or your boss might say, you know what, we're changing the strategy because I'm pretty confident this is a great feature to do. Now that can be dangerous, obviously, and many a company has gone under with that kind of decision making. That's not based on, it's based on sort of a whim at that point. But the point is that gives you the ability to have that conversation. Now, the other side of that conversation is if somebody asks you, if your boss asks you, okay, well, you've got this feature on the roadmap. In fact, I think this is the next slide. Why is this feature on the roadmap? Why did you choose to do feature X instead of feature Y? And you can say, well, feature X is very well aligned with the objectives that you gave me for our strategy. And then we can have a conversation about that. Well, maybe they don't agree that it's well aligned. Maybe your market model is wrong in that case. Or maybe they need to be shown how well it aligns. You can do the same for the question about the feature that's not on the roadmap that they might have thought was going to be. And it might be, well, it didn't align as well with these other things. And then if they ask, please add the feature to the roadmap, then you have an answer for that as well. So you can have these conversations in a much more structured way. So you can continue to use your intuition and be smart, be the smart person in the room, but you can also have this backup that helps you have the better conversations. So some of the potential pitfalls here, well, one of them is I've already talked about. We still have too many features. We may have too many well-aligned features. We may have a bunch of features that align to the strategy, but we still can't do them all because we don't have the capacity. So what do you do in that case? Well, it's not like I was going to make your job super easy as a product manager. I'm giving you a tool here. So strategic alignment is really a way to narrow down the set of features that you have to consider but it's not going to eliminate necessarily enough to enable you to not have to make some hard decisions. So one approach is to add some additional criteria on top of that and to help you decide. So for example, you might have, as I have here, 10 features that are well aligned, but you really can only do five features. You only have the capacity to do 5. And so what do you want to do? You want to choose a set of features that go together in some sense. So you're using a little bit of an additional set of decision making to help you decide amongst these 10, right? You may have these 3 things that sort of create a coherent whole that you can maybe talk about or feature in the launch. These other 2 things that also create a coherent whole. And then the other 5 aren't really related too well to those. And so you're going to choose the 5 that you can tell a nice story about. Or you may have some that are dependencies on others, and that often determines which features you end up doing. Another potential approach is to say, well, I've got these 10 high priority features, which if I deliver them all would give a huge amount of value in the market. But what if I partition or decompose some of these features and I don't deliver quite as much value, but I do a lot less work, right? Thinking about the 80-20 rule. Is there some of these features where I can deliver 80% of the value, but only 20% of the work, or 20% of the effort, or 20% of the resource capacity? And then maybe I can include a few more. I'm not going to deliver as much value to market, but I'm going to be able to get a lot more stuff out there in a bigger sense. So that's another potential way to think about what to do in this case of too many features. Now, another very common strategy is that common problem is that the strategy is not actually very well defined. And so you have to, in that case, kind of listen, put your ear to the ground, and figure out what is the real strategy, right? It might not be articulated, but people probably have, particularly executives, probably have some kind of idea in their head about what they are expecting to achieve, and you have to then infer that and figure out what its main components are, and then start to model your prioritization against that. This is pretty common. Now, you really want the executives to have articulated the strategy in a concrete way that lets you make better decisions and have those conversations. But even if they haven't done that, oftentimes you can infer what's going on or what makes a sensible strategy out of the types of conversations, and then use that as your straw man, and then you present the roadmap using that as your strategic objectives, using what you've inferred as your characterization of the strategy, and then you can test that with your executives. Say, well, what I've heard is that you think that opening up in Germany is going to be the thing to do, and it's not necessarily written down anywhere, but that seems like a good direction to go, and then they can agree or disagree. And so then you can have a conversation about your prioritization again. So let's talk about how to put this into action right away. So what can you do? Well, you can certainly start creating a market model for your features. Now, you might be able to do some of this within your tool if you have a tool that allows you to put labels or tags or something on your feature. Ideally, this is actually really structured data because it makes it a lot easier to do analytics on it and to do things like show me all the features that are aligned with the financial services market, and then at another time show me all the features that customer A has asked for. If you can do that, that's pretty powerful. There's not that many tools for product managers that allow you to do those kinds of queries, but at least you can start putting them together, and at least in your head kind of thinking, oh, this is going to give me value here, this is going to give me value here. Maybe you put that into just as text into the feature or something like that. It makes it not analytic, but at least you can use it when you're trying to justify your decisions. Obviously, you want to get your organization's strategy, whether it's explicit or implicit, as I just mentioned, and start to use it to align to your market model to see what features are best aligned with that. And then you also want to be practicing how to have these conversations that are based on analytics or whether it's qualitative or quantitative. So those are the 3 things you can start doing today. I think this is a great way to think about your features generally, is to think, well, who is benefiting, what segments are benefiting. To know, it's really great to know specific customers that have requested certain things, because then when you go talk to those customers, or when your sales team goes and talk to those customers and you've implemented their features, that's a great way to sell them or to get them to renew, or potentially sometimes to hold something over. If you want to sort of urge them to renew, you can say, hey, if you renew, we're considering doing this feature that you really wanted, and it's very aligned with our strategy. And then even if you're planning to do it anyway, you can use that as a sales tool. So it's really useful to have this mental model, or this model. If it's just mental, that's one thing. If you can have it actually in the system, that's even better. So if you have a good market model for your features, you can use the strategy to help you prioritize it. Your intuition still plays a big part in this, and it doesn't solve all of your problems with prioritization, because there's still more to do than you have time to do. Now, that is it for this little talk about strategic prioritization. Hope you found this interesting. And if you did, let me know. Leave a comment below. If you have additional questions, again, leave a comment below. If you want to see more from me, I have the book, The Secret Product Manager Handbook, as I put up there. I have, I'm out there on Twitter. I have the blog. You can go to the blog. All that stuff is under secretpmhandbook.com. I also have a podcast, and that's at alltheresponsibility.com. Hope you enjoyed that. Again, let me know. If you liked this video, please click the like button. If you like this type of stuff, subscribe to my channel. Leave me comments. I love that. I always respond. And until next time, this is Nils Davis signing out.